Something pressed against your chest from the inside. A vibration so deep you couldn't hear it, only feel it rattling through your ribcage like a diesel engine running in your bones. Your stomach lurched. The air felt thick, wrong, like breathing through wet concrete. Then the forest went completely silent. Not quiet, silent. Every bird, every insect, every whisper of wind through the pines just stopped. Even your own breathing seemed too loud, too human, too out of place in this vacuum of sound that shouldn't exist in nature. That's what Thomas wrote in his journal on October 15th, 2023, deep in the Adirondack wilderness near Mount Marcy. He had no idea he was experiencing what locals call the Oz effect, that terrifying moment when something massive forces nature itself to hold its breath. Have you ever been in the woods and felt that sudden, heavy silence? Tell me in the comments, did you stay? Or did your instincts tell you to get out? The massive footprints found around his campsite told only part of the story. The thermal footage he captured that night revealed something far more unsettling. To understand what stalked Thomas through 3 nights of psychological warfare, we need to go back to where this pattern of terror first emerged. The Adirondack mystery, a pattern emerges. The reports started flooding in during the summer of 2022. Experienced hikers, seasoned hunters, people who had spent decades in these mountains suddenly describing identical encounters that defied explanation. Sarah Mitchell was bow hunting near Lake Placid when it happened. Alone in the fading afternoon light, armed only with a compound bow, she was tracking a white-tailed buck when the forest suddenly transformed around her. The woods just stopped, she told investigators. Complete silence pressed down like a physical weight. The air itself felt heavy, wrong, thick with the smell of wet pine, and something else, something musky and wild that didn't belong. My fingers trembled as I tried to nock an arrow, but there was nothing to aim at. Just that overwhelming feeling that something massive was watching me from the tree line, close enough to touch. 3 weeks later, David Chen reported the exact same phenomenon while camping in the High Peaks region. Complete silence for maybe 2 minutes, then this low rumble, almost below hearing. My dog was shaking uncontrollably. By December 2023, we had documented over 40 similar accounts, all clustered around a specific geographic area spanning from Lake Placid to the High Peaks wilderness. The consistency was impossible to ignore. What makes these encounters particularly compelling is their connection to Native American warnings that date back centuries. The Mohawk spoke of forest giants in these mountains, creatures they called the stone throwers, beings that could make the very wilderness fall silent with their presence. Scientists think they know why this happens. Dr. Rebecca Torres studies how animals use sound, but studying these particular sounds nearly cost her everything. When she first presented her infrasound findings to colleagues at Cornell, they questioned her methodology, her data, even her judgment. Taking on cryptid research meant risking her tenure, her reputation, everything she'd worked for. But she couldn't ignore what the recordings revealed. We're detecting subsonic frequencies between 14 and 20 hertz consistently across multiple sites. These frequencies are below human hearing, but can cause profound psychological effects. Infrasound at these frequencies can trigger fight-or-flight responses, feelings of unease, and yes, cause wildlife to fall completely silent. Large mammals, including great apes, are known to use infrasound for long-distance communication and territorial marking. The pattern that emerged was always the same. First, the sudden silence that witnesses describe as unnatural. Then, the feeling of being watched from the tree line. Finally, if the person remained in the area, clear signs of a massive bipedal presence, footprints measuring up to 18 inches, broken branches 8 to 10 feet off the ground, and that characteristic musky odor that experienced researchers recognize immediately. What sets the Adirondack encounters apart from typical Bigfoot reports is the level of intelligence and territorial aggression being displayed. These aren't random sightings or fleeting glimpses. These are calculated interactions with a creature that seems to be actively studying human behavior. The geographic clustering tells its own story. The encounters center around areas where new hiking trails have been cut in recent years, places where human activity has increased dramatically since the pandemic drove more people into remote wilderness areas. It's as if something that had remained hidden for decades suddenly found its territory under invasion. Track casts collected from multiple sites show variations that suggest we're dealing with more than one individual. The largest prints measure 18 inches with a stride length, indicating a creature over 8 feet tall. Most compelling are the smaller prints found alongside the larger ones, juvenile tracks that tell a story of family groups moving together through territories they've claimed for generations. This changes everything about the territorial aggression. These aren't monsters attacking random hikers. These are parents protecting their young from what they perceive as an invasion. The stone throwing, the psychological warfare, the methodical intimidation tactics, they're all designed to drive threats away from areas where juvenile members of their species are vulnerable. The fierce territorial behavior we've documented suddenly makes perfect sense when you realize we're witnessing the protective instincts of intelligent beings defending their children. Environmental damage at encounter sites follows consistent patterns. Trees twisted and broken in ways that would require immense strength. Stone stacks appearing overnight in areas where no human had been. Territorial markers that seem designed to send a clear message: this land is claimed. But it wasn't just the size of the creatures that shocked investigators. It was the evidence of a coordinated strategy. As we look at the thermal data, pay close attention to how the creature interacts with the equipment. It suggests a level of intelligence that mainstream science isn't ready to acknowledge. The pattern was clear, but the proof remained elusive until September 2023. That's when a veteran researcher captured something that would prove the Adirondack mystery was far more than folklore. But as we examine the thermal footage, notice how the creature methodically studies each camera in the triangle formation. It suggests tactical intelligence that mainstream science isn't ready to acknowledge. The thermal evidence, what the camera revealed. Mark Stevens had been researching cryptid encounters for over 15 years, but nothing prepared him for what his thermal cameras captured on September 23, 2023. He had positioned 3 FLIR units in a triangle formation around a site where multiple witnesses reported the Oz effect phenomenon. At 11:47 p.m., all 3 cameras simultaneously detected a massive heat signature moving through the forest with deliberate, calculated steps. The footage shows a bipedal figure standing approximately 8.5 feet tall, moving between mature pine trees with an intelligence that immediately rules out any known wildlife. Using the surrounding pine trees as reference points, trees that Stevens had measured at exactly 42 feet in height, the creature's proportions become clear. Its shoulder width spans nearly 4 feet. The thermal signature shows a core body temperature consistent with a large mammal, but the size and bipedal movement pattern matches no known species in North America. Frame-by-frame analysis reveals something even more compelling. The creature walks just like a human, stepping from heel to toe, but its steps are over 6 feet long. Based on the heat on the camera, this animal weighs between 600 and 800 pounds, yet it moves through the forest with remarkable stealth. Dr. Sarah Chen, a primatologist from the University of Vermont, analyzed the footage extensively. The movement patterns are consistent with a large primate, but the proportions are unlike anything in the fossil record. The arm length relative to body size, the broad shoulder structure, the way it navigates obstacles. This isn't a bear, it's not a person in a suit, and it's certainly not any known wildlife. To eliminate any possibility of researcher bias, Stevens submitted the thermal footage to a panel of 3 independent primatologists from different institutions, without revealing the location or context. All 3 reached identical conclusions. The movement patterns were definitively non-human and could not be attributed to any known North American wildlife, including bears. The unanimous consensus from experts who had no stake in the cryptid debate adds significant weight to the evidence. To put that in perspective, a world-class heavyweight boxer has a reach of about 80 inches. This creature's reach, based on the thermal data, would make a professional athlete look like a child. We aren't just looking at a large animal, we're looking at a biological anomaly. What makes this footage particularly valuable is the creature's behavior during the recording. For nearly 12 minutes, it methodically examines the area around Stevens's camera equipment. It approaches each thermal unit, studies it from multiple angles, then deliberately moves to position itself where all 3 cameras can capture its full profile. The intelligence displayed is unmistakable. This isn't an animal accidentally wandering into camera range. This is a creature that understands it's being monitored and chooses to reveal itself on its own terms. Comparison to known wildlife thermal signatures from the Adirondacks shows clear distinctions. Black bears, even the largest males, show completely different movement patterns and body proportions. Moose, while tall, lack the bipedal locomotion and show distinctly different thermal patterns in their extremities. The footage also captures the creature's interaction with its environment. At one point, it reaches up to a branch nearly 11 feet off the ground, bending it down to examine something. The casual ease with which it accomplishes this demonstrates both its remarkable height and its comfort in this terrain. Expert analysis of the thermal data reveals additional details invisible to the naked eye. The creature's breathing pattern, visible through temperature fluctuations around the head and torso, shows the controlled respiration of an animal at rest, not one that's been running or stressed. This suggests it had been observing the area for some time before revealing itself. Most significantly, the footage shows the creature engaging in what can only be described as territorial marking behavior. It systematically breaks specific branches, stacks stones in deliberate patterns, and leaves clear footprints in areas where they would be easily discovered. Look closely at that behavior. Is that a curious animal, or a creature that understands exactly what a camera is? I want to hear your theories on why it chose to reveal itself that night. The thermal evidence represents a breakthrough in cryptid research because thermal imaging doesn't lie. Unlike traditional photography, which can be manipulated or misinterpreted, thermal cameras record heat signatures that correspond directly to living tissue. The data from Stevens's cameras provides measurable, scientific evidence of something massive, bipedal, and intelligent moving through the Adirondack wilderness. Seeing the creature on thermal is one thing. Feeling its presence before it even appears is another. This brings us to the most unsettling discovery in the Adirondack files: the science behind the silence. The Oz effect, when nature holds its breath. The phenomenon that witnesses describe as the Oz effect has a scientific foundation that makes it even more terrifying than folklore suggests. When Dr. Rebecca Torres analyzed the infrasound recordings from Adirondack encounter sites, she discovered something that changed our understanding of how these creatures operate. The subsonic frequencies we're detecting aren't random, Dr. Torres explained. They're being generated in specific patterns, almost like a language. These sounds travel for miles through dense forest, and they have a profound effect on every living thing in the area. Her findings align with cutting-edge 2026 analysis from the Uwharrie National Forest research so recent that most cryptozoologists haven't even heard about it yet. Over 600 audio clips were analyzed using Audacity spectrogram software, the same technique that's revolutionizing cryptid vocalization research across North America. The frequency patterns Dr. Torres documented in the Adirondacks match the exact non-wildlife signatures found in North Carolina, suggesting coordinated communication across vast geographic distances. What you're learning here is the same scientific methodology being used by researchers right now, in 2026, to decode what might be the first documented evidence of Sasquatch language. You're getting access to analysis techniques that are literally changing how we study these creatures. Most compelling is the military cryptologic linguist analysis of similar recordings from the 1970s Sierra Sounds. A trained professional in identifying language patterns concluded these vocalizations contain discernible language structures, organized communication that follows linguistic rules rather than random animal calls. Feel that low rumble in your chest? That pressure behind your sternum? That's what 19 Hertz does to your body. In laboratory conditions, it causes nausea and disorientation. In the Adirondack wilderness, it's a biological warning system you can't consciously ignore. Infrasound between 14 and 20 Hertz triggers a freeze response, an evolutionary survival mechanism that forces prey to go motionless to avoid detection. What we're seeing in the Adirondacks suggests something is using this biological response as a hunting or territorial strategy. That pressure in your chest isn't just fear, it's physics. Drop a yes in the comments if you've ever felt a vibration you couldn't hear, but could feel in your bones. The psychological impact on human witnesses is equally documented. Research on wilderness survival psychology shows that these encounters trigger primal survival instincts honed over millennia, causing a measurable 40% increase in stress management responses as the human brain attempts to process an unidentifiable threat. Exposure to infrasound at these frequencies causes feelings of unease, panic, and the sensation of being watched. Dr. Torres' research shows that even brief exposure can trigger fight-or-flight responses that last for hours after the sound has stopped. The isolation amplifies these effects, potentially causing dissociation and decision-making pressure, as witnesses struggle between the instinct to flee and the inability to identify the source of danger. It's psychological warfare, said retired park ranger Jim Morrison, who experienced the Oz effect during a patrol in October 2023. You know something's wrong, but you can't put your finger on what. Every instinct is screaming at you to run, but you can't identify the threat. Morrison's encounter near Heart Lake demonstrates the calculated nature of these interactions. I was checking a remote campsite when everything went dead quiet. Not just quiet, silent, like the forest was holding its breath. Then I heard this low rumble, so deep I felt it in my chest more than heard it. The infrasound generation appears to be connected to the stone stacking behavior observed at encounter sites. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a geophysicist from Syracuse University, has studied the acoustic properties of these stone formations and found something remarkable. These aren't random rock piles, Dr. Rodriguez noted. They're acoustically engineered. The spacing, the size of the stones, even the types of rock being used. It all creates resonance chambers that can amplify low-frequency sounds across vast distances. Acoustically engineered stone stacks. If these aren't just random piles, what do you think they're signaling? Is it a warning to us or a message to others of their kind? The stone stacks function like natural amplifiers, taking the infrasound generated by these creatures and broadcasting it throughout their territory. This explains how the Oz effect can be experienced simultaneously across multiple locations separated by several miles. One witness would experience the full terror of what comes after the silence, in an encounter that would redefine our understanding of just how aggressive these territorial guardians could become. Wildlife behavior during these events provides additional evidence of the phenomenon's reality. Trail cameras positioned throughout the High Peaks region have captured footage of deer, bears, and other animals suddenly freezing in place, then fleeing en masse, all without any visible threat present. The most compelling footage comes from a trail camera near Lake Tyr of the Clouds. The video shows a group of 6 white-tailed deer feeding normally when they suddenly stop mid-bite, ears erect, completely motionless for nearly 2 full minutes. Then, as if responding to some invisible signal, all 6 animals bolt simultaneously in different directions. Behavior that wildlife biologists describe as completely unnatural for a feeding group. The animals know something we're only beginning to understand, said wildlife biologist Dr. Michael Chen. They're responding to a predator signal that we can barely detect with our equipment. These creatures are using infrasound the way wolves use howls, to coordinate, communicate, and control their territory. The timing of Oz effect incidents follows distinct patterns. Most occur during twilight hours when infrasound travels most effectively through cool, dense air. The frequency increases during new moon phases when darkness provides maximum cover. Weather patterns also play a role. Incidents spike before major storms when atmospheric pressure enhances sound transmission. Experienced hikers who've encountered the phenomenon describe a progression that suggests deliberate psychological manipulation. First comes the silence, a complete absence of natural forest sounds that can last anywhere from 30 seconds to several minutes. Then the feeling of being observed, often accompanied by the distinctive musky odor that researchers associate with these creatures. If the person remains in the area, the experience escalates. Witnesses report hearing branch breaks and footsteps circling their position, always just outside visual range. Some describe finding massive footprints the next morning, positioned where they would be impossible to miss, clear evidence that something had been studying them throughout the night. The Oz effect represents more than just an interesting acoustic phenomenon. It's evidence of intelligence, planning, and territorial behavior that suggests we're dealing with something far more sophisticated than a simple unknown animal. These creatures understand human psychology and use our own biological responses against us. One witness would experience the full terror of what comes after the silence, in an encounter that would redefine our understanding of just how aggressive these territorial guardians could become. The siege, when aggression turns deadly. Thomas Brennan thought he understood wilderness camping. 23 years as a forest ranger had taught him to read the signs, to recognize when something wasn't right in the woods. But nothing in his experience prepared him for what stalked him through 3 nights of escalating terror near Mount Marcy in October 2023. What makes Thomas's encounter invaluable isn't just the terror, it's the survival blueprint he accidentally created. His journal entries reveal the 3 distinct phases of primate intimidation tactics that could save your life if you ever find yourself in similar territory. Understanding these phases isn't just fascinating, it's survival knowledge. Great apes, including chimpanzees and gorillas, use identical escalation patterns before physical confrontation. If you can recognize what phase you're in, you can predict what comes next and respond appropriately before the situation becomes deadly. His journal entries from those nights provide a chilling timeline of how these creatures operate when they decide a human has crossed into territory they won't share. Night 1 started normally. Thomas had hiked 8 miles into a remote section of the High Peaks wilderness, far from any established trails. His goal was simple: collect water samples from an unnamed stream for the State Environmental Survey. He made camp just before sunset, following protocols he'd used hundreds of times before. The Oz effect hit at 9:15 p.m. Complete silence for maybe 3 minutes, he wrote. Then I heard it breathing. Deep, controlled breaths from somewhere in the tree line. Too deep for a human. Too rhythmic for a bear. What happened next revealed the calculated intelligence behind these encounters. Something began systematically testing the perimeter of his camp. Not random movement, deliberate probing. Thomas could hear footsteps circling his tent at exactly 50 feet distance, maintaining that precise range for over an hour, It knows exactly how far my flashlight beam reaches, he noted, staying just outside the light. This isn't animal curiosity, this is reconnaissance. By morning, the evidence was unmistakable. Massive footprints formed a perfect circle around his campsite, each print placed with mathematical precision. His water bottles had been moved, not scattered or damaged, but repositioned in a straight line pointing back toward the trail. The message was clear: leave. Thomas didn't leave. As a scientist, he recognized he was documenting something unprecedented. That decision nearly cost him his life. At this point, Thomas had every reason to run. Most people would have. If you found a circle of footprints around your tent, would you hike out in the dark or stay to see what happens next? Night 2 brought escalation. The breathing returned, but closer this time. Around midnight, something began throwing stones at his tent. Not randomly, but in a pattern. 3 stones from the north, pause. 3 stones from the east, pause. The creature was moving around his position, demonstrating its ability to approach from any direction. "It's playing with me," Thomas wrote, "testing my reactions. When I shine the light toward one sound, it immediately makes noise from the opposite direction. This thing is studying my behavior." The psychological pressure was deliberate and relentless. Every time Thomas began to relax, a new sound would jolt him alert. Branch breaks, footsteps, the scrape of something massive moving through underbrush. Always just close enough to be threatening, never quite close enough to see clearly. Dawn revealed the true scope of what he was facing. His camp had been surrounded by a network of broken branches, each snapped at exactly 8 feet off the ground. Trees had been pushed over to form barriers blocking potential escape routes. Most disturbing of all, his hiking poles had been removed from outside his tent and planted in the ground like spears, forming a perimeter around his sleeping area. "It's not trying to hide anymore," Thomas realized. "It wants me to know I'm trapped." At this point, Thomas had every reason to run. Most people would have. But he noticed something on the morning of the 3rd day that made leaving impossible. A detail so small, he almost missed it, but one that proved he wasn't just being stalked, he was being herded. His water bottles, moved the first night into that straight line pointing toward the trail, had been repositioned again. But this time, they pointed toward a completely different exit route. The creature had studied his potential escape paths and was systematically closing them off, one by one. Thomas wasn't just documenting an encounter anymore. He was trapped in a psychological experiment conducted by something far more intelligent than he'd imagined. Here's the survival blueprint that Thomas unknowingly documented. Great apes, including chimpanzees and gorillas, use identical psychological warfare before physical confrontation. They display aggression through intimidation tactics, chest beating, branch throwing, territorial marking, to avoid actual combat that could result in injury. What Thomas experienced follows the exact 3-phase escalation pattern documented in primate research. Phase 1. Reconnaissance and territory marking. The creature studies your behavior, tests your perimeter, and leaves obvious signs of its presence. This is your warning phase. Most people who leave during Phase 1 are never harmed. Phase 2. Psychological pressure and escape route limitation. Direct intimidation begins. Stone throwing, vocalizations, systematic blocking of exit routes. The creature is giving you one final chance to leave voluntarily. Phase 3. Direct confrontation. Physical aggression becomes inevitable if you remain in claimed territory. Understanding these phases could save your life. Thomas was about to enter Phase 3, but his survival decision reveals something crucial about how to respond. Night 3 brought the full fury of territorial aggression. The creature abandoned all pretense of stealth. Around 10 p.m., something massive slammed into a tree just 20 feet from his tent, with enough force to shake the ground. The sound echoed through the forest like a gunshot. Then came the vocalizations, deep, guttural sounds that seemed to originate from multiple directions simultaneously. Audio analysis later revealed these weren't random calls, but structured communication, one creature coordinating with others positioned around the camp. "There's more than one," Thomas wrote in shaking handwriting. "They're talking to each other, planning something." The assault on his camp began systematically. His food cache, properly hung 15 feet up a tree, was torn down and scattered. His water filtration system was dismantled piece by piece. Most terrifying of all, something began testing the structural integrity of his tent, pressing against the walls with enough force to bend the aluminum poles. Thomas made the decision that saved his life. Instead of waiting for dawn, he packed his essential gear and began hiking out in complete darkness. The creatures followed him for over 2 miles, maintaining perfect pace with his movement, letting him know they could end this pursuit whenever they chose. His survival strategy revealed something crucial about these creatures' limitations. They seemed unwilling to attack directly, preferring psychological warfare and intimidation. The aggression was territorial, not predatory, designed to drive intruders away rather than harm them. The encounter represented a new level of documented Sasquatch behavior, but what happened to Thomas Brennan is a chilling case study, and it's just one data point in a massive territorial shift that is currently reshaping the entire Adirondack wilderness. The Territory War, mapping the expansion. The data tells a story that wildlife officials didn't want to acknowledge. Between 2020 and 2024, Sasquatch encounters in the Adirondacks increased by over 400%, with the geographic distribution revealing a pattern that suggests coordinated territorial expansion rather than random sightings. Dr. Patricia Hayes, a wildlife corridor specialist from SUNY Environmental Science, mapped every documented encounter using GPS coordinates provided by witnesses. What emerged was a clear picture of systematic range expansion radiating outward from 3 core areas: the High Peaks Wilderness, the Faro Lake Wilderness, and the remote sections around Cranberry Lake. This isn't random distribution, Dr. Hayes explained. These encounters follow specific corridors that connect previously isolated habitat areas. Something is actively expanding its range using natural travel routes that avoid human detection. It's easy to see the connection. More trails mean more sightings. In 2021, the state opened 40 miles of new trails in deep, wild areas where people never used to go. Within 18 months, every single new trail system had documented Sasquatch activity. The timing suggests these creatures had been living in complete isolation until human encroachment forced them to defend territory they'd occupied for generations. The aggressive encounters weren't unprovoked attacks. They were defensive responses to what these creatures perceived as an invasion. Seasonal patterns in the territorial behavior reveal sophisticated understanding of human activity cycles. Encounters spike dramatically during late fall and early spring, when hunting seasons bring armed humans into remote areas. The creatures seem to recognize the increased threat level and respond with heightened aggression. Winter months show a different pattern entirely. Encounters drop to nearly zero, but evidence of territorial marking actually increases. Massive tree breaks appear overnight in areas where no human activity has been recorded. Stone stacks multiply across the landscape like boundary markers. The creatures are maintaining their territorial claims even when they're not actively confronting intruders. The Adirondacks provide perfect habitat for an undiscovered primate species. Over 6 million acres of protected wilderness, with vast areas that see no human presence for months at a time. Ancient forests with canopy cover dense enough to hide massive creatures from aerial surveillance. Water sources, food diversity, and cave systems that could shelter family groups year-round. track analysis from multiple encounter sites reveals evidence of at least 3 distinct individuals, possibly more. The largest prints, measuring 18 inches with a distinctive toe spread pattern, appear consistently in the High Peaks region. Smaller prints, likely from juveniles, are found alongside adult tracks near Faro Lake. A third set of prints, notable for a damaged left foot that creates an asymmetrical gait, has been documented across the Cranberry Lake area. The behavioral differences between these individuals suggest complex social structures. The High Peaks creature demonstrates the most aggressive territorial behavior, actively confronting human intrusion with psychological warfare tactics. The Faro Lake group shows more cautious behavior, preferring to observe from distance and leave subtle warnings. The Cranberry Lake individual appears to be the most intelligent, creating elaborate stone formations and demonstrating problem-solving abilities that border on tool use. Radio collar data from local wildlife populations provides additional evidence of territorial expansion. The most compelling case involves a mature male black bear, designated as Bear 247 by the Department of Environmental Conservation. For 3 years, this 400-pound male had maintained a prime territory near Heart Lake, perfect habitat with abundant food sources and established den sites. In September 2022, Bear 247's GPS collar showed something unprecedented. Within a single week, he abandoned his entire territory and relocated over 12 miles away to a marginal habitat area with limited food sources. The collar data showed he never returned, even during peak foraging season when his old territory offered the richest feeding opportunities in the region. Wildlife biologists were baffled. Bears don't abandon prime real estate without a compelling reason, explained DEC biologist Sarah Martinez. The energy cost of relocating that distance, especially to inferior habitat, suggests he encountered something that fundamentally changed his risk assessment of that area. The timeline of Bear 247's relocation corresponds exactly with the first documented Sasquatch encounters near Heart Lake. Other collared animals show similar patterns: sudden, permanent abandonment of established territories following cryptid activity in those areas. The implications for future human-cryptid interactions are significant. As recreational pressure on Adirondack wilderness continues to increase, territorial conflicts will inevitably escalate. These creatures have demonstrated remarkable intelligence and adaptability, but they've also shown they won't retreat indefinitely. Wildlife management officials face an impossible situation. They can't acknowledge the existence of an undiscovered primate species without concrete proof, but the mounting evidence suggests we're heading toward a confrontation that could endanger both human visitors and these remarkable creatures. The territorial expansion represents more than just animal behavior. It's evidence of a species fighting for survival in a rapidly changing world. The weight of truth, what science can't ignore. The physical evidence from the Adirondacks represents the most compelling cryptid documentation in North American history. Hair samples collected from broken branches show DNA sequences that don't match any known primate species. The keratin structure indicates a creature related to great apes, but with genetic markers suggesting evolutionary divergence over 300,000 years ago. That 300,000-year evolutionary timeline explains why the Mohawk called them stone throwers. These creatures have had millennia to perfect their territorial strategies, developing the exact 3,000 psi torque force needed to twist massive trees into deliberate markers that warned generations of indigenous people about claimed territory. Dermal ridges visible in the clearest casts match patterns found only in living tissue, showing a flexible arch, opposable big toe, and pressure distribution patterns that would require extensive knowledge of primate anatomy to replicate. Environmental damage at encounter sites tells its own story. Trees twisted with torque forces exceeding 3,000 pounds per square inch. Stone formations requiring coordination between multiple individuals weighing over 600 pounds each. Territorial markers positioned with mathematical precision across landscapes spanning hundreds of square miles. That 300,000-year evolutionary timeline explains why the Mohawk called them stone throwers. These creatures have had millennia to perfect their territorial strategies, developing the exact 3,000 psi torque force needed to twist massive trees into deliberate markers that warned generations of indigenous people about claimed territory. Mainstream science demands laboratory proof, but that's a near impossible standard for an intelligent creature that actively avoids detection. Subscribe right now to join our research team, because we're decoding a history that's been hidden in plain sight for centuries. Dr. Elena Rodriguez from Syracuse University represents the growing number of scientists willing to examine the evidence objectively. We have thermal imaging, audio recordings, physical traces, and consistent witness testimony spanning multiple years. At what point does scientific skepticism become willful ignorance? Mainstream science demands a body, but the people living in the Hudson Valley don't need a laboratory to tell them what they've seen. If you've experienced the Oz effect in this specific corridor, tell us your story in the comments. Your data might be the piece of the puzzle Dr. Rodriguez is looking for. Mainstream science demands a body, but the people living in the Hudson Valley don't need a laboratory to tell them what they've seen. If you've experienced the Oz effect in this specific corridor, tell us your story in the comments. Your data might be the piece of the puzzle Dr. Rodriguez is looking for. The credibility of witnesses adds weight to the documentation. These aren't cryptid enthusiasts or attention seekers. Forest rangers, wildlife biologists, experienced hunters, and long-term residents, people whose livelihoods depend on accurate observation of wilderness conditions. Their consistent descriptions of behavior, physical characteristics, and territorial patterns create a body of evidence that's becoming impossible to dismiss. What sets this evidence apart is its integration with established scientific principles. The infrasound generation, territorial expansion patterns, and seasonal behavior variations all align with known primate behavior, while demonstrating adaptations to North American wilderness conditions. The responsibility of researchers extends beyond simple documentation. We're potentially dealing with an endangered species that's been forced into territorial conflicts by human encroachment. The aggressive encounters in the Adirondacks may represent the last stand of a population that's running out of places to hide. Future research requires collaboration between cryptozoologists, wildlife biologists, and indigenous knowledge keepers who've maintained oral histories of these creatures for centuries. The Mohawk warnings about stone throwers weren't folklore. They were accurate behavioral descriptions passed down through generations of coexistence. The validation is stunning. When researchers overlaid GPS coordinates of modern Sasquatch encounter hotspots with digitized versions of traditional Mohawk territorial maps marking forbidden zones, the overlap was nearly 100%. Areas that indigenous people avoided for centuries are the exact locations where contemporary witnesses report the most intense cryptid activity. This isn't coincidence. It's generational knowledge that modern science is only now beginning to understand. According to tribal elder Joseph Bruchac, the traditional teaching was simple. When the forest goes silent, you stop walking. You stand still, show respect, and wait for permission to continue. If the silence holds for more than the time it takes to count to 100, you turn back the way you came. The stone throwers are telling you this path is not yours today. The mounting evidence demands acknowledgement from the scientific community, not for the sake of cryptozoology, but for the preservation of what may be our closest living relatives. The silence is spreading. If you think the Adirondacks are active, you need to see what we just uncovered in the Hudson Valley. But before we go there, we have to look at the final piece of the puzzle. Thomas Brennan survived his 3 nights in the high peaks, but the wilderness he returned to was forever changed. He never forgot what he wrote in that journal on October 15th, 2023. The air felt thick, wrong, like breathing through wet concrete. Now we know why 19 Hz infrasound literally changes air pressure, creating that suffocating sensation that warned him something massive was close enough to touch. But Thomas paid a price for that knowledge. He told colleagues he can no longer walk alone in the woods without constantly looking over his shoulder, listening for that moment when the birds stop singing. The truth he documented in those 3 nights took away something he'd cherished for 23 years as a forest ranger, the peace of mind that comes from feeling at home in the wilderness. Some discoveries change you in ways you never expected. The Adirondack encounters have shown us something profound about the boundaries we thought we understood. These creatures aren't hiding from us anymore. They're teaching us where we belong. The next time you're in the woods and the birds stop singing, you aren't just experiencing a weird phenomenon. You're standing on the edge of territory that was never really yours to begin with. That pressure in your chest, that feeling of being watched from the tree line. Your body is responding to a warning system that's been operating in these mountains for centuries. The choice Thomas faced in his tent that 3rd night is the same choice we all face now. Do we respect the boundaries being drawn by creatures far older and wiser than our maps suggest? Or do we push deeper into territory where the rules of engagement have already been written in stone stacks and broken branches 8 feet off the ground? The silence is spreading beyond the Adirondacks. Reports are emerging from the Green Mountains, the White Mountains, the entire Appalachian corridor. Something is moving, expanding, reclaiming territory we assumed was abandoned. Subscribe right now to join our research team, because this investigation is just beginning. The silence isn't just a local phenomenon anymore. It's becoming a language we need to learn before it's too late to listen.